Navy SEAL Jake Carter had been in worse situations. That's what he kept telling himself as he tried to ignore the searing pain in his wrists, the throbbing ache in his skull, and the cold metal of the handcuffs biting into his skin. He had been trained for captivity, trained to endure, to outlast, and to escape. But as he sat in the damp darkness of what he assumed was an underground holding cell, he knew this was different. He wasn't being held by insurgents looking for a ransom, nor by a foreign government hoping for intel. No, this was something far worse. This was a game. The mission had seemed straightforward, too straightforward in hindsight. Infiltrate an off-the-books compound in South America, retrieve a missing asset, and get out. Standard Black Ops work. But everything had gone sideways the moment they stepped onto enemy soil. His team had been ambushed before they even reached their objective. The intel had been wrong, or worse, compromised. He barely remembered the firefight, only the sudden, sharp sting of a dart piercing his neck, then the world going dark. When he woke up, he was alone. His gear was gone, his hands were bound, and the only thing greeting him was the sound of distant laughter. Footsteps approached, and the heavy metal door groaned as it swung open. Light flooded the room, blinding him momentarily. A man stepped inside, his silhouette tall and imposing. He was dressed like someone with too much money and too much power, a tailored vest, expensive boots, and a polished demeanor that screamed control. "Ah, you're awake," the man said, his voice smooth, almost amused. "Good. We were beginning to worry you wouldn't make it in time for the festivities." Jake said nothing, letting his eyes adjust, studying the room. The man smiled at the silence, then crouched to his level. "You're special, aren't you? We did some digging. Navy SEAL, highly decorated. A survivor. That makes this so much more interesting." That was when Jake noticed the others standing behind him. 5 men, dressed in hunting gear, their expressions ranging from curiosity to excitement. "You've been chosen," the man continued, "for a tradition that's existed longer than you can imagine. The strongest prey makes for the best sport." Jake knew exactly what that meant. He'd heard the whispers before, stories of ultra-wealthy sociopaths who hunted humans for fun. But stories were just stories. Until now. "We'll give you a fair shot," the man said, standing again. "A knife, some water, and a 10-minute head start. Survive until dawn, and you win." Jake's jaw tightened, his heartbeat slow and steady. He could tell they were expecting fear. Maybe even begging. Instead, he smiled. "You sure you don't want to call it off?" The man chuckled. "That's the spirit." They marched him out of the cell, into the open air. The jungle stretched out before him, thick, humid, and full of opportunities. The hunters gathered, sipping whiskey, checking their rifles. They weren't worried. Jake took a deep breath as they unlocked his cuffs. His hands were free. The knife was placed into his palm. "Run," the man said. Jake didn't hesitate. He darted into the trees, vanishing into the darkness. The hunt had begun. The first few minutes were crucial. He wasn't just running, he was calculating. The terrain, the possible traps they might set, the direction of the wind. He moved silently, barely disturbing the leaves beneath his feet. He could hear them behind him, laughing, walking leisurely. They were confident. Arrogant. That would be their first mistake. Jake climbed a tree, moving with practiced precision. From above, he could see them spreading out, their expensive boots crushing the undergrowth. They thought they were in control. They weren't. He waited until the last of them passed beneath him before dropping down, swift and silent. The nearest hunter barely had time to react before Jake's arm wrapped around his throat. A quick, efficient snap, and the man went limp. Jake took his gun, his radio, and his ammunition. He moved quickly, vanishing before the others even noticed one of their own was missing. He could have run. He could have tried to escape. But that wasn't the plan. These men thought they were the hunters. They had no idea that the real predator had just begun his hunt. The jungle belonged to Jake now. The moment he took out the first hunter, the balance shifted. They thought they were here for a sport, an easy, thrilling chase where they could play with their prey before finishing him off. But Jake was no prey. He was a seal, forged in battle, trained for survival. And now, he was the one doing the hunting. He didn't rush. Every movement was calculated. He used the terrain, the natural cover of the dense jungle, the unpredictable elements that his hunters weren't prepared for. They were rich men playing soldier, used to hunting defenseless people who didn't know how to fight back. They had money, weapons, and numbers. But Jake had something they didn't: experience. The next hunter never even saw it coming. Jake had circled around, tracking their movements. He studied their pattern, their spacing, and waited for the perfect moment. The man was cocky, walking with his rifle slung over his shoulder, humming to himself. He had no idea he was already dead. Jake struck fast, one arm wrapped around the hunter's throat, the other hand forcing the rifle down before he could raise it. The man struggled for only a few seconds before his body went limp. Jake eased him onto the ground, stripping him of his gear and radio. Another one down. The rest of the group was starting to feel it. The arrogance in their voices over the radio was gone, replaced by frustration. "Where the hell is Todd?" one of them whispered harshly. "He was right behind us," another answered. "I'm telling you, something's off." Jake smiled, crouched in the foliage, listening. They were beginning to understand, but not fully. Not yet. That would come soon enough. The tension among the hunters was thickening. The game wasn't fun anymore. They had expected a chase, a hunt, a thrilling evening where they could toy with their target and then celebrate over expensive whiskey when it was done. Instead, they were the ones being picked off. One of them, a younger man with nervous energy, was panicking. "I don't like this," he muttered. "We should call it off." "Call it off?" Vincent Cain, the leader, scoffed. "We're not calling off anything. He's just one man. He's one man who's killed two of ours." Jake could hear them, their fear seeping into their words. It was only going to get worse. A sudden snap in the distance sent them all spinning around, rifles raised. "Did you hear that?" one whispered. A rustling came from the trees. Another snap. They turned, scanning the darkness, their expensive night vision goggles flickering in and out of focus. But there was nothing. Because Jake wasn't there. He had set them up, tied one of their own radios to a tree, rigged with a delayed broadcast loop of footsteps and static interference. It was simple, but effective. Their paranoia did the rest. The nervous one fired first, a blind shot into the shadows. "Damn it, don't waste ammo!" Cain hissed. But it was too late. Another shot rang out. Then another. They weren't being hunted anymore. They were unraveling. Jake kept moving, always in control, always ahead. He didn't waste bullets, he didn't need to. He let them exhaust themselves, let the fear settle into their bones. He left small traces, misleading clues, signs that he had gone one way when he had really gone another. The more they thought they were on his trail, the more lost they became. One of them, a heavy-set man with a beard, stumbled too far from the group. He was breathing hard, muttering to himself. Jake watched from above, perched in a tree, waiting. The moment the man passed beneath him, Jake dropped, landing silently behind him. Before he could react, Jake's knife was at his throat. "Ship," Jake whispered. The man didn't even have time to scream. By now, Cain knew. He wasn't hunting anymore, he was surviving. And surviving was something Jake Carter did better than anyone. "Listen up," Cain growled over the radio, his voice laced with barely contained fury. "Enough playing around. We regroup at the clearing. No more splitting up. We move as one." But Jake had already planned for that. They were heading straight into his final trap. Cain and the last two hunters reached the clearing, a small open space surrounded by thick jungle, moonlight casting eerie shadows across the ground. "This is bad," one of the remaining men whispered. "We should have brought more people." Cain didn't answer. His fingers gripped his rifle tightly. He was finally starting to grasp what was happening. They weren't just dealing with a trained soldier. They were dealing with a man who was built to survive. A sound echoed from the treeline. Then another. Cain spun, aiming his weapon, but there was nothing there. Another snap. Then the realization hit him. The sounds weren't random. They were circling. Surrounding them. Jake wasn't just hunting them. He was hurting them. The remaining hunter panicked and bolted, sprinting toward the trees. Cain reached for him, but it was too late. He barely made it 5 feet before Jake's rope trap yanked him into the air, leaving him dangling upside down, screaming. Cain turned, his chest rising and falling rapidly, the last man standing. His expensive clothes were soaked in sweat, his refined demeanor long gone. And then, from the darkness, Jake's voice finally broke the silence. "You should have called it off." Cain whirled, firing wildly into the night, but he was too slow. Jake was already behind him. Cain had never felt fear like this before. Not real fear. The kind that seeped into your bones, that made your breath shallow, your hands tremble. He had always been the predator, always the one in control. Money could buy a lot of things: power, influence, even life itself, if he knew the right people. But tonight, money meant nothing. Out here, in the depths of the jungle, against the man he had chosen as his prey, it was worthless. He was the last one left. Jake Carter had taken out the others with terrifying precision. One by one, they had disappeared into the night, their bodies claimed by the jungle, leaving only Cain standing. And now, he knew what it felt like to be hunted. His breath came in short, ragged gasps. He pressed his back against a thick tree trunk, gripping his rifle so tightly his knuckles went white. The clearing was quiet now. No wind. No insects. Just silence. That was worse than any sound. He couldn't see Jake, but he knew he was out there. Watching. Waiting. Cain forced himself to think. He was no soldier, but he wasn't an idiot either. Running would be suicide. Staying still was just as bad. He needed to get out of here, back to camp, where he had supplies, weapons, a way out. Slowly he moved. Every step was deliberate, careful. His expensive boots, once pristine, were now caked in mud and blood. He tried to ignore the bodies. The men he had brought here, men who had paid a fortune for the thrill of the hunt, were nothing but corpses now. A snap to his left. Cain spun, rifle raised, his heart hammering. Nothing. And then, behind him, a whisper. "You're not very good at this." He barely had time to react before Jake's fist slammed into his gut. The force knocked the wind out of him, and before he could recover, Jake grabbed his rifle and yanked it away. Cain stumbled back, falling to the ground. Jake stood over him, calm, collected. There wasn't a scratch on him. Cain scrambled backward, eyes wide. "Wait!" he gasped, holding up a shaking hand. "Wait! We can talk." Jake tilted his head slightly, as if considering it. "Talk?" Cain nodded quickly, swallowing his fear. "You win, all right? You win. Name your price." Jake crouched down, resting his forearms on his knees. "Price?" he repeated, as if the word was foreign to him. Cain forced a grin, trying to summon the charm that had worked in boardrooms, in government offices, in every room where power dictated the rules. "I have money. A lot of it. Enough to make this all disappear. You walk away, I wire you whatever you want. You'll never have to work another day in your life." Jake was quiet for a long moment. Then, he let out a small chuckle. "You think this is about money?" Cain hesitated. "Everyone has a price." Jake leaned in closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not me." Panic surged through Cain. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He had bribed politicians, generals, people who ran entire countries. And yet, sitting in the dirt, staring into Jake Carter's cold, unblinking eyes, he realized something that made his blood turn to ice. Jake wasn't here to negotiate. Cain lunged, reaching for the knife at his belt. Jake moved faster. Before Cain's fingers even touched the handle, Jake's boots slammed into his chest, pinning him to the ground. Cain gasped as the air was forced from his lungs. Jake grabbed the knife himself, flipping it in his hand, considering. "You should have left me in that cell," he said. Cain barely had time to scream. When it was over, Jake stood up, wiping the blade clean. He looked down at the man who had orchestrated this entire nightmare, the man who had thought himself a god, above consequence. Now, he was nothing. Jake exhaled, letting the tension drain from his muscles. The jungle around him was quiet again, but this time, it wasn't because of fear. It was because the hunt was over. He turned and walked away, leaving Cain's body behind. No one would ever find it. By the time the world learned what had happened here, Jake would be long gone. Jake moved through the jungle with the same calculated precision that had kept him alive. The hunt was over, but his mission wasn't. He had no idea how long he'd been out here, days maybe? It didn't matter. Time didn't work the same way in survival mode. The body adjusted, adapted, kept going. The mind never stopped calculating. He found what he was looking for near the edge of the hunting grounds. A small, well-hidden outpost. It wasn't the luxurious lodge where the hunters had been drinking and laughing before the nightmare began. This was a functional command post, likely used by the staff who ran the operation. Inside, Jake found exactly what he needed. A radio. He adjusted the frequency, his fingers moving with muscle memory. There was no room for error. Sending the wrong signal could get him killed. "This is Viper. Requesting immediate extraction." His voice was steady, controlled. "Coordinates incoming." Static. Then a response. "Viper?" The voice on the other end hesitated. "Jesus. We thought you were dead." "Not yet," Jake replied, punching in the encrypted location code. "But you need to move fast." "Roger that." "Bird's on its way." Jake exhaled slowly. The first step was done. Now, all he had to do was stay alive a little longer. He leaned against the wall, letting the exhaustion settle in. His body ached, his ribs were bruised, but none of it mattered. He had done what he came to do. And in a few hours he'd be out of this hell. He glanced at the pile of documents on the table. Ledgers, manifests, lists of names. The people who had been hunted before him. Jake clenched his jaw. He had survived. But how many hadn't? He stuffed the files into his pack. This wasn't over. The helicopter came at dawn. Jake heard it before he saw it, the distant thrum of rotor blades cutting through the sky. He stepped into the open, raising a hand as the sleek black aircraft descended. The side door slid open, and a familiar face leaned out. Lieutenant Commander Harris. Jake climbed aboard, gripping the extended hand that pulled him in. "Jesus, Carter," Harris said, looking him over. "You look like hell." Jake smirked, settling into the seat. "You bring me a beer?" Harris laughed, shaking his head. "We get intel that an entire hunting party is wiped out in the jungle, and you're worried about a beer?" Jake leaned back, closing his eyes for just a second. "Priorities." Harris exhaled, then turned serious. "You get what we need." Jake opened his pack, tossing the stack of files onto the seat between them. "More than enough." Harris glanced at the papers, his expression hardening. "So it's true. These bastards have been doing this for years." "Yeah," Jake said. "And we're gonna make sure they don't do it again." Back at the base, the reality of what he had uncovered started to sink in. Intelligence teams pored over the documents, their expressions shifting from confusion to horror. The operation was bigger than anyone had realized. Cain's little hunting club wasn't just a sick game for the ultra-rich. It was an organized, well-funded enterprise spanning multiple countries. High-profile targets. Military prisoners. People who were supposed to disappear without a trace. And Jake Carter had just blown it wide open. Within days, governments were scrambling. Some denied involvement. Others launched investigations. The media caught wind, and suddenly, the world was watching. Names were exposed. Politicians, CEOs, military officials, people who thought they were untouchable. Jake watched it all unfold from a distance. He wasn't interested in the politics. He didn't care about the press conferences or the statements of outrage. He only cared that the hunts had stopped. But he knew the war wasn't over. Because men like Cain weren't the only ones out there. There were others. Jake sat alone in a briefing room, staring at the files spread across the table. There were still names that hadn't been accounted for. Others who had financed these hunts. Others who had taken part. Harris stepped inside, crossing his arms. I know that look. Jake didn't look up. There are more of them. Harris sighed. We shut this one down. That's a win. Jake finally met his gaze. Not enough. Harris studied him for a long moment, then exhaled. I figured you'd say that. He dropped a folder onto the table. We've got a lead. Could use a guy like you to follow it. Jake flipped it open. More names. More locations. More targets. He smirked. Looks like I'm not done hunting. The story spread faster than Jake expected. At first, it was just whispers, rumors among military circles, intelligence agencies trading notes, high-ranking officials wondering how a classified Black Ops mission had turned into an international scandal. Then the media got hold of it. Reports of an elite group of billionaires hunting humans for sport. A massacre in the jungle. The name Jake Carter surfacing in hushed conversations. He didn't care about the attention. The headlines meant nothing to him. He had done what needed to be done. But the world wasn't letting go so easily. Journalists speculated. Was he a rogue soldier? A ghost who had taken justice into his own hands? Some painted him as a hero, the man who took down the untouchable elite. Others weren't so kind. Conspiracy theories formed overnight. Some claimed it was all a government cover-up, that he had been part of the operation all along. Jake ignored it. But soldiers didn't forget. He walked into a bar near the base one night, and the place went quiet for a moment. Eyes followed him as he made his way to the counter. Someone muttered his name. The bartender, an older man with a grizzled face, smirked as he set down a bottle of beer. On the house. Jake raised an eyebrow. What for? The man chuckled. For the guy who walked into a jungle full of hunters and walked out alone. Jake shook his head, but took the beer. I didn't walk out alone. The bartender nodded. Yeah. You carried their sins with you. Jake didn't respond. He just drank. But the legend was growing, whether he liked it or not. Not long after, the first message came. A discreet envelope slipped under his door. No name. No return address. Just a note. They're still out there. Jake already knew that. He had spent weeks sifting through intelligence reports, piecing together the remains of Cain's empire. Cain had been powerful, but he wasn't the top of the food chain. There were others. Wealthier. Smarter. More dangerous. Cain had been reckless. These others? They would be careful. But careful didn't mean untouchable. Jake packed light. A bag, a few essentials. He didn't need much. Just enough to get to his first target. Harris caught him at the airstrip. You really going after them? Jake adjusted the strap of his bag. Somebody has to. Harris sighed. You know, most guys in your position would take the win. Let the suits handle the rest. Jake glanced at him. You really think the suits are gonna stop them? Harris didn't answer. Jake climbed into the waiting plane, the engines already humming. As the aircraft lifted off, he stared out the window at the base fading into the distance. He wasn't sure when, if, he'd be back. It didn't matter. Somewhere out there, more men like Cain were still hunting. Jake was going to make sure the hunt ended with them.